Contrary? None? Carried unanimously. Thank you for that. We'll now move to item 7.2, the response to the targeted consultation on rates, otherwise known as the rates cap. So I shall, in deference, I shall put my rates cap on while we mock this piece of ridiculous legislation. And I have a can of baked beans here which represents the amount of saving that a month of that the ratepayers will get as a result of this fine work. It was independently assessed by somebody or other, and in that assessment they actually removed Auckland Council because our rates rises weren't sufficiently high to make it to the can of beans. We've got, the governing has asked us for technical feedback on this idea that even their agencies don't support. I did point out that there are better ways to be re-elected, but we've got Michael, Violet and Ross here to talk about our feedback, the first part of which is opposition to the central government re-election policy. And in short, we have actually kept our rate increases low, and we have been re-elected, so they haven't yet. And I enjoyed learning from Councillor Williamson how the tax take has gone from 77 billion to 115 billion, a rise of 48%, and rates have gone from 1.9 billion to 2.7, a rise of 40%, which is not either a big number either, in fact. The second part is that some suggestions on how to improve it. If they decide to keep this ridiculous policy, there are better ways of being re-elected than this. I note that it could actually lead to higher costs, all for a can of beans. There is some danger here. This could threaten our excellent credit rating, which is based on the fact that we can rate to get the money back, and so it could accidentally increase rates. But there you go. I'm mocking it a bit, but I'm sure it's excited some government bean counters, but there you go. I'll move this, and I think Councillor Hills will rush to support this fascinating piece of nonsense from Wellington. But there you go. I'll put it over to our august staff who will take us through this fine piece of work. Thank you, R.
Okay, good morning everyone. So in terms of the process and timeline here, so the government announced on the 1st of December their proposed rates targeting scheme, or generally known as rates capping. They have, they're not at the point of calling for submissions. They've asked for some detailed technical feedback, 5 questions about how the formula should work. So on the 1st of December, they've released some very limited information. It's just about a 4-page document, 2 pages with a 2-page appendix with a diagram that doesn't kind of make a lot of sense in terms of the formula. So it's been not a lot to go on in terms of policy initially. We've had discussions with DIA. We've asked for more information around the policy behind it. We received a whole lot of papers that were proactively released just before Christmas. We received hundreds of pages on Christmas Eve. The feedback is due tomorrow, so not a lot of time to work through all that stuff, but we've done our best in the time frame. These are technical. They're asked, as I said, for technical feedback around the formula and the technical elements, but we have kind of taken a broader view around what do we think of the policy, what are the implications, and we've kind of gone a bit broader, and so I think it's important we bring it to the governing body to make sure you're comfortable with the feedback that we are providing. So in those papers that came out, it was really interesting reading to see the cabinet paper, but also the staff advice and that went in behind it. And there it's very clear that almost all government departments didn't support the proposal. They saw it as undermining a lot of their work programs where they're trying to work with local governments to achieve a range of policy objectives. Treasury in particular expressed some serious concern that rates capping may lead to underinvestment in infrastructure, which could create significant long-term challenges for the country. As part of the documents, there is quality assurance standard. There's independent reviews around the quality of the advice. The quality assurance statement in those documents found that there was a mismatch between the problem identified, the evidence available, and that the analysis was limited by the options the options considered were limited by previous government decisions. Overall, the staff advice, the government official advice concluded there was insufficient information analysis to allow ministers to make a properly informed decision. But they've made a decision anyway, and so we're giving our feedback on how to make the most of what is out there. As the Mayor's talked about, they've done some analysis around what are the benefits in terms of reducing rates, and they've identified $2.79 per month, but they've done that by excluding Aucklanders, so Aucklanders wouldn't get that benefit. There will be benefits to other ratepayers and other jurisdictions. As we've kind of gone through and analysed a lot of the support information, it's pretty clear that DAA and other advisors have drawn heavily on Australian examples, in particular in New South Wales, where there's been rates capping for some time. So the analysis, there's been independent reviews and analysis of the situation in New South Wales. The findings have been found that rates capping has created challenges for financial sustainability. About 50% of the councils in New South Wales have identified that, have reported that they have underfunded maintenance, and their funding of maintenance is inadequate. There is an exemption process where councils in New South Wales can go and ask to spend more money than the cap. Out of 128 councils, 127, all but one, have had to apply for an exemption to make it work. That process can take 18 to 20 months, so it's a very long time-consuming process to be able to get exemptions. And so what that's meant in practice is some councils have to prepare two budgets, one with government approval and one without. So you create these parallel budget processes and lots of time and uncertainty. So I guess those are the concerns we're worried about. If that's what our budget process starts to look like, it becomes very unmanageable and will create significant challenges for delivering for Auckland. In the New South Wales example, the caps there have been, it's changed over time, but the upper range has been 5 to 5.5%. So even up at 5 and 5.5% compared to the 4%, those councils have struggled. It's also important to note that in New South Wales there is significant funding from state government, general purpose subsidies, which aren't available in New Zealand. And some of that is funded by GST being returned to state government to funnel through to local councils. So none of that exists here. So we see that this policy could create some significant challenges for council. In terms of our current plans, we've worked really hard through each long-term plan to balance affordability versus investment in Auckland. So we're completely supportive of making sure rates and all other charges are affordable for Aucklanders, and that's part of the balance that we carefully give advice on. And I know it's been considered through each budget that there's always already a lot of consideration around affordability. So we don't think this policy is necessary or useful for Auckland. And we see it as creating some potential unintended consequences. It can limit what we can do. We have got, our current projection over the long term is a 3.5% rates increase. It's slightly below the 4%, but that gives us a very thin margin of error, 15 million. But we do know that even with our existing long-term plan, there's a lot of investment in there, but there is tens of billions of dollars of growth infrastructure, transport infrastructure, climate resilience infrastructure that that's not provided for. So it does create challenges for us. So in the draft submission we've kind of set out some of these challenges and issues, and then we kind of go to, well, if it is going to happen, what does a least worst option look like? So we need to think about how do we make sure we are, it's not creating unintended consequences for the credit rating. It will clearly be negative for the credit rating, but we don't want to make sure, we want to make sure it doesn't create drastic problems immediately. And we need to make sure that we don't have a unwieldy budget process that's really bureaucratic and time consuming and that really gets in the way of trying to deliver for Auckland. A key element of what the government's trying to do is provide certainty for ratepayers and avoid shocks. But the key challenge that we've seen with rates is not the percentage increase each year, which has largely been pretty moderate. It's the revaluation impacts where we've seen large swings and lots of people having 20, 30% rates increases. And this policy doesn't really address that at all. So I guess those are kind of some of the key points. I'll pass across to Violet to just outline a little bit more about the specific feedback we've outlined.
Thank you, Ross. As you've just gone over, DIA has written to our Chief Executive as part of their targeted consultation on the specific rates target model that the government has designed. In short, this model has a target range of 2 to 4% for rates increases based on economic indicators. While this is stated to be a target, we would need to apply to a regulator to move outside the span, making it more of a hard cap than a target. So in preparing our response to the targeted consultation, we've structured it into 3 core parts. The first part of the response outlines the Council's principled opposition to rates capping. The key reasons for this are, as Ross has said, Aucklanders are just unlikely to make the savings of $2.79 a month that the government has modelled up. Auckland Council's rates trajectory was excluded from these calculations given our moderate rates forecast as described by the government. The Council has been able to maintain this trajectory through the financial strategy where we already set a rates limit and consider rates affordability as a proportion of household income. And this has been supported by our strong value for money program. Auckland also has a large projected investment needs in areas such as reducing congestion, supporting population growth, where we're projecting growth equal to the size of Wellington over the next 30 years, and resilience in the face of a changing climate. Rates capping constrains the key potential funding source in addressing these challenges. Finally, the rates capping model may impact on our financial sustainability. Reviews of that New South Wales model have found that rates pegging has eroded the financial sustainability of their local councils. And our credit rating agencies have stated that this is a credit negative measure. This is because we would face greater constraints on our revenue generation at a time where revenue pressures remain elevated due to persistent inflation, wage growth, and infrastructure needs. The second part of our draft response identifies changes to the proposed model we see as necessary if the government insists on proceeding with a rates capping regime. Any rates capping model should not have unintended consequences for our credit ratings. This would not only increase our borrowing costs, but would also increase the borrowing costs of the entire sector, given we are the largest guarantor of the LGFA. Any rates capping model should not introduce unnecessary bureaucracy when the Council and Government agree on co-funding a shared priority. Any rates capping model should have an adequate target band. A 4% maximum is unlikely to be sufficient in order to address both Auckland's strategic challenges, but also any short-term volatility in interest rates or inflation. And lastly, a quick, inexpensive and predictable regulatory environment. Rather than councils being required to seek pre-approval from a regulator, in which, as Ross has said, in other jurisdictions can take 18 to 20 months, we've suggested a regulatory environment where when you move outside the range, it could trigger regulatory consequences such as increased oversight. This would be more equivalent to the Reserve Bank model it seems the government is relying on. The third and final part of the response outlines more specific responses to DIA's questions. In general, the response outlines that the Council does not support a formula which uses economic indicators in setting a target. Rates fund long life infrastructure in public and quasi-public goods, which is very different from much of the economy. We've also highlighted other challenges in the proposed formula, which include that relying on long-run estimates for inflation and economic growth could create problems when inflation and interest rates move beyond these levels in the short to medium term, as we're seeing right now with inflation at 3%. And also that relying on the consumer price index is a bit flawed, when the Council's basket of goods usually contains more construction materials, software, and specialist staff than the average consumer. In terms of next steps, the Council needs to submit this response to DIA tomorrow. After that, the government has stated that it wishes to enact legislation during 2026 for the law to be in place on 1st of January 2027. If the government does proceed, the full regulatory model will be in place on the 1st of July 2029. However, transitional arrangements will require us to consider the rates band when setting rates in the meantime. Given the timeframes on this more technical response have been compressed, We're looking forward to putting together a more comprehensive submission as part of any select committee process with more engagement across the council group. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Councillor Sayers, please.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you for that. You mentioned that, Auckland kind of wasn't considering some of those calculations. Is Auckland potentially through the Auckland deal or any other mechanism able to be excluded from the rate caps via other mechanisms, e.g. the Auckland deal?
It's theoretically possible, but frankly unlikely.
Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you. Yes, we had conversations with government yesterday, which they made it very clear that we're just like any other council. The questions I had on the funding. So it seems to me that the New South Wales model has two parts. One is the rates capping, but also the other part is the financial assistance grants. So the New South Wales government give about $3.5 billion worth of grants to councils for general purposes, and that, yes, there's local roads and we get that, but everything from general services to community services and education, admin and governance, recreation and culture, community amenity, public order, health and safety. It would seem, it's a bit of a patsy question, do you think that the government's kind of tried to apply the stick without any carrot?
Yes, so yeah, you're quite right. So New South Wales is different. There are general purpose grants. We don't have those. We have transport subsidies that are very specific. Also, state governments generally provide a lot of infrastructure rather than councils, and most councils don't use debt for anywhere near the degree that New Zealand councils do. In terms of, the government has kind of acknowledged there are some issues with the New South Wales and they want to tweak it a little bit, but they've kind of gone for a lower cap at 4%. So it's not quite clear exactly how that's done it. There doesn't seem to be, as part of this policy, any carrots. There's no grants, incentives, GST returning as part of this policy anywhere.
Okay. On the ratings agency, and we did bring this up at a meeting yesterday, essentially, isn't this similar to the problem we had with Three Waters, and the whole reason why they were split off is so that they were able to borrow as much as they needed, but also raise funds as much as they needed, obviously within a auditing process as well. Does this put a stranglehold on our ability to borrow at cheaper percentages, I guess, cheaper rates?
Yes, so the key issue with water was the unaffordability of the infrastructure investment required, and so the model for water care is financial separation. It's enabling them to empowering them to borrow with a strong credit rating, and water care will be subject to economic regulation by the Commerce Commission. The model there is all about the regulator going, well, what is the right level of infrastructure? What are the infrastructure requirements? And then, therefore, what is a fair price to pay for that? It doesn't start with setting a price cap, regardless of the infrastructure investment. So, and arguably, the water economic regulation that really starts with what is a sustainable level of infrastructure investment is probably a better model than what we've got here.
And on this, do we know who this unelected body will be? The government goes on a lot about unelected people making decisions. What and who will these people be, and what and how will they be responsible to the public? Like, how do we know they will accept our request?
For the regulator, so it's not clear. There's no clarity around who the regulator will be or how that will work. So that is, to be determined. One of the key issues that we sort of set out in our submission is around service levels. Does the regulator decide, how much parks is required, how many community facilities are required, the right service? How do you determine that? Is that a regulator determining service levels for local communities?
Yeah, with the other question is on, so the good examples, and some people will think, well, your LTP is going to land largely under 4, so why does it matter? But the reasons why we've gone up higher than that were record high worldwide inflation, storms, extreme weather events. Do we know that all of those will be accepted, or could this regulator turn around and go, well, yep, you've had a storm, but you need to sell your port, you need to charge for library books, you need to charge the sports fields first before you go over 4%?
So in the material we've seen, they talk about it as two different categories. For things like storm events, natural disasters, then the direction, it's not clear how it works, but the kind of general direction is that councils should be able to do those things without asking for permission up front. You can just do it, and provided, so you don't have to go to a regulator, but you do need the minister's permission. So it's kind of ministerial discretion about whether something is a big enough disaster or not. And then the other bit in terms of investment in infrastructure projects, that's apply to a regulator for permission ahead of your LTP, which we're concerned would require long, lengthy lead times, overly complicates an already lengthy budget process, makes it really challenging. And what if through consultation you get different community preferences? Do you then start that process all over again?
And thank you, Mayor. And my last question, just on the rating agencies downgrading us even slightly because of our lack of access to immediate funds, which is a big part of our why we've got such a good credit rating. Could it mean that that slight tweak could end up meaning that we end up paying more on interest than we would on services, and then we're capped? So say even a 0.5% change in our borrowing could be, what, $70 million a year?
So if there's an impact on our credit rating, it could have significant impacts on our on interest costs. I mean, it's not clear. Rating agencies have looked at the proposal. It's clear that this is unhelpful. There are other factors that are helpful for Auckland in terms of having a future fund and water care separation and at the moment good strong budgets that are quite prudent. Good management of debt. But they have kind of signalled that they'll keep a close eye on things, and they'll see, well, what, do debt levels increase? Does deferred maintenance build up? And so from the Australian example, it's clear that these things have, these kind of policies haven't had an impact on financial sustainability. So there is a risk that there is an impact on the credit rating, and that will depend partly on the legislation and the detail of that. It'll depend on what budget decisions get made as a consequence of it. But you're quite right. If there is a credit rating downgrade, if investors are less likely to lend to us on favourable terms, it could mean higher interest costs. And the way the cap would work is that would then displace money we can spend on services and infrastructure. So it makes the problem that much worse again.
Thank you.
Thank you. That Councillor Fuller, please.
Yeah, thanks, Your Worship, and thanks, team. Many of my questions have been answered by Councillor Hill's really good questions. I guess I'm just sitting here wondering, given the unintended consequences that New South Wales has gone through, is it even possible, and given that there's no, the government's not proposing to provide a source of funding, a carrot, so to speak, is it possible then for those unintended consequences not to happen? What's your feeling on that, if you're able to answer? Kia ora.
We struggle to see a way to completely avoid unintended consequences. We've tried to make submissions around how can you minimise them and make the best out of a bad situation. In some of the papers, they've talked about various models and options from a target range to sort of hard and fast caps. So a model, and I think as Violet's outlined, we would prefer a model that had an indicative targeted range where things can vary outside of that, rather than having to go and ask permission in advance and then consult with the community. That you make good decisions, have a clear budget. If you go above it for a little bit, then the government will go, oh, please explain what are the drivers. They'll look at it and then they'll give you direction. And then there's a series of steps, intervention steps, if a council is outside of the range for a period of time without good, compelling reasons for that. So something that with that kind of flexibility, I think would overcome some of the challenges that we've seen in New South Wales, but the devil's in the detail. Well, how does that government intervention work? How and when do they regulate? But we think it'll be much more practical for us to have something that has that flexibility rather than go and ask permission, wait months and months. And then by the time you've kind of gone through that process, long detailed budgets, governments, elections will have changed, will have happened, priorities will have changed, and it could become quite unworkable. So we're trying to suggest make the best of it. How do you make the best of a bad situation? What does the least worst policy look like?
Kia ora, thank you, and I appreciate that really comprehensive answer as well. And we will have another opportunity to give feedback during the select committee process, is that correct?
That's our understanding of the government's intention, is to bring legislation through and have submissions through a normal select committee process, probably towards the middle of the year.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Turner, please.
Thank you. You know, now that I've learnt how rudimentary our levers of control are in this political world, do you not think that this is it's a radical thing, but what's driving it? Is it an overall public opinion that the money they pay us in rates that we're wasting, that we're not delivering properly with it? So therefore this is a very rudimentary lever to try to pull us back into a different sort of spending practice, and if so, I mentioned things like the P27 reviews, a 10-year full facilities contract, which is going to be for around about 2.3 billion over the next 10 years. That's more than baked beans sitting there, and we don't seem to be looking at that with great vigour. Do you not think that this rates cap is just a crude lever to try to get us to look more firmly at our operational activities and costs?
I guess you'd have to sort of ask the government and ministers what their driver is behind the policy. I think we are looking very carefully at those things, and through the Value for Money Committee and through all the various committees and government body, there's a lot of focus, there's a lot of incentive already. Political direction is very clear to look at efficiencies, look for value for money. What it's said in the policy papers, the problem that they've articulated is, some councils have had persistently high, double-digit rates increases, and there's a perception that some councils have, spent a lot of money on nice-to-haves. It's not really clear what that is or what things they're talking about, but there's a kind of there's a view that councils have strayed from spending on core services, and that the high rates increases, 10 to 20% rates increases year after year, is not sustainable. But none of that really, that situation does not apply to Auckland.
Thank you.
Councillor Ferry, please.
Kia ora, thank you. I guess quite a good opportunity to follow on from Councillor Turner's question. I mean, my sense of the purpose of this is to lower the impact of rates on households. And I guess one thing I noted that I feel missing from the submission, if we were to speak to that, if we think that is the underlying driver, right, is that there are alternative revenue options that may be more productive than trying a rates cap. And so, obviously, bed night levy discussion, the return of GST, which happens in New South Wales, the removal of the fuel tax, which had a significant financial impact on this council. So I do wonder if it's worth us expressing that in some way through this, that if the driver is to reduce council's reliance on rates revenue and therefore the impact of rates on residents, then alternative forms of revenue we think would be more appropriate to achieve that aim. Is that something that staff would support or that we could potentially add? Thank you.
I think that makes a lot of sense. As we talked about carrot and stick, the government isn't offering any carrot through this. So I think, using this as an opportunity to ask for those tools would be really helpful. We have done that a little bit in the submission. There's a little bit about the bed tax levy. And yeah, we have noted the New South Wales example, but we can have a look at beefing that up potentially.
Maybe just to add to that, so if the problem is, rates are unaffordable for some communities across the country, and there's a whole bunch of unavoidable infrastructure cost pressures, how do you relieve that situation? And if there's other revenue streams, other taxes, etc., then that can be a solution. The Cabinet paper and advice ignores all of those things, excludes that from any consideration, so there's nothing in there to go on. We can certainly add some of that stuff into the submission as Violet's outlined.
Great, thank you. The other question I had was there's some stuff in there about not being able to really, given the timeframes and the fact that the information came out, I think you said Christmas Eve, and the deadline is tomorrow, being unable to have those conversations with local boards and understand fully the impact on targeted rates that they may currently or in the future seek, and also the bid rates. So at the moment, I think the submission, points that out well. Do we have any sense of what kind of future work we might sort of preemptively be able to do? Because I'm worried that we end up with a similarly tight timeframe again in the future. Is there some conversation we could sort of preemptively have with the bids team, with local boards about, hey, if there were to be this kind of scheme, what could that look like for you? I guess I'm just trying to think about how do we get ahead of this if we again end up with a short time frame that doesn't recognise how long it takes us to reasonably have those conversations. Thanks. So that was more of a process thing rather than the other one was more of a substantive thing. Thanks.
Yes, I think you're right. The timeframes here are compressed, and then the timeframes going forward may well be compressed. I think we could start to have some of those conversations now that with local boards and bid teams, business associations, etc. And the discussions we've had with DIA, they've made it really clear they see this as a sort of a comprehensive rates cap that includes all rates. So including if a local board wants to consult with the community and they want to have more costs, they pay more locally to achieve higher services. That's part of the cap. Similarly, a bid association or even at an individual ratepayer level, there's things like if we want to use voluntary targeted rates for retrofitting someone's house or some storm damage for their property, that those even if someone voluntarily signs up for a rate, it's part of a cap. And so there are barriers to doing things even when people want to do things, which we don't think necessarily makes a lot of sense. If the problem is to try to reduce the rates burden for people. So the policy is clear at the moment. We can make our submissions. We think that the coverage there should be more thinking around that. We can start to have those discussions and then build up some of those views to make sure that it can then inform at the later stage.
Thank you. And final question was just around the exemption process. I just find it very confusing, the idea that we would potentially have an 18-month turnaround on a process that we undertake on an annual basis. Yes. How could that possibly work? And in the meantime, while we were waiting for a decision from a regulator, what would we charge? And we wouldn't be able to strike a rate, or we would have to strike a rate that was at the maximum while we sought an exemption and then get, I don't know, back charge people? How could that possibly work? Thanks.
I think it's a great question. We're not quite clear how all that works. The discussions we've had with DIA is they really see the LTP as the key process. So it's every 3 years you decide how much to spend and you don't vary from that, and that you would go and seek your exemption through the LTP before going and consulting with the community. So it makes the LTP process, which already takes 18 months, longer. If it's going to take 18 months to get approval, then that's like 3 years, a whole electoral term, to put in place a long-term plan, which would be kind of ridiculous. So we're not quite sure how that would work in practice, but we're concerned that if we want to make progress on Auckland's infrastructure challenges and progress priorities in partnership with government, we need to have a bit of flexibility. We need to be able to make investment decisions and budget choices in a reasonable time frame.
Thanks very much.
Very good question. So Nick, perhaps the 18-month thing versus the annual plan ought to be highlighted in your submission. I've got the Deputy Mayor Simpson next, please.
Look, thanks for this. A lot of my questions have been answered, so I'm just trying to pull them apart for the ones that are left. But certainly, look, I want to start with a question around, you know, if dare I quote him, the problem they're trying to solve. I mean, there's no doubt that what they're trying to do here is prove to the country, Auckland being a big part of that, that we don't want big high rates. Council should be more efficient at what they do. And I think, you know, so my suggestion is, can we start with something along the lines of, we agree that, you know, council should hold our rates as low as possible. And then to that end, because I think that's the whole reason. I mean, I saw the RNZ survey, you know, people don't, it's one of the biggest expenses people have. So if you could start at the very beginning with the problem and say, look, we absolutely support your intention here, that councils, you know, don't have unrealistic and unaffordable rates rises for the you know, the people of the country. But then I think you need to go into some more detail around what we actually have done. And I'm going to ask you a question, is if we can strengthen, first of all, point 15, which is about our infrastructure deficit. So my understanding is, you've talked about New Zealand, but my understanding that Auckland's infrastructure deficit looks at something like 50 billion, right? So if we are going to be able to deliver that infrastructure benefit and catch up, we should actually talk about not what New Zealand's infrastructure deficit is, but what ours is. So my question is, can we add something in that to strengthen that point? Because the point I'm trying to make is we're doing a lot. Second point is, can we make in the submission that we're not part of the calculations? In other words, we start with what we want to achieve with you. We're not part of the calculations. This is some of the things we're doing. Point 18, my question is, to help you on point 18, we talk about value for money, one of my little pet loves, and you've only talked about the last 3 years. Value for money has delivered over $1 billion in the last 6 years. Now, that's a big number. So I wouldn't just restrain yourself to the last 3 years. Point 18, you talk about the previous term of councils, we delivered more than 600 million of financial benefits and blah, 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 which is really point. But why don't you cover the last 6 years? You know, $1 billion, big number. On the rates cap of the maximum of 4%, can you, if this is going to happen, whether we like it or not, are you thinking that there is a higher number than 4%? Or are you thinking never a number? Because if this is going to happen, can we, you know, when I look at what we've got up, should we be saying, if you are going to do it, we suggest that the number is 6%. So those are some starter for 10s. And the other thing is, I absolutely back the if it's going to take 18 months, you make it LTP focused. You can't make it annual plan focused. So can we make sure that that's in there as well? So those are some of my questions.
Yeah, maybe just reverse order. So in terms of the, you know, I think LTP focus is helpful, but not everything can wait for long-term plans. So, you know, when we've had storm impacts in the buyout scheme, we can't just tell people wait for the long-term plan. We've had CRL cost changes and things. We've had to make decisions quickly. So a number of things can wait for the long-term plan, but we also need the flexibility to adapt. We can't always wait until the right point in a 3-year cycle. So yes, we can. Yeah, long-term plan is better than annual plan, but there needs to be, how do we make this quick decisions when Auckland needs quick decisions?
Just because I stop you there, so that's really good. So let's do that. But can we give them some tangible examples, e.g., you know, because I think you just need to give examples why this is really challenging for us. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. In terms of the 4%, you know, I think we tried to make it pretty clear on the submission. We think 4% is too low, and a higher number would be better. You know, if say 4% was a midpoint, that would be a good start. But the other element is just, as opposed to what the number is, well, what does the number mean? Is it a hard cap? You can't go go above without prior permission, or is it an actual target where there's variability, and if you're above it, you have to explain, justify, and there's a process to resolve it if you're above. It's some of the advice in the cabinet paper and support information talks more about that model, that target model, as opposed to a hard cap. But then some of the policy stuff come through, applies it's more of a hard cap, you must ask permission in advance. So we kind of want clarity on that, and we think something that has more of a target as opposed to a hard cap would be much more workable.
One more thing, can we also talk to the fact that what we are doing as a council to get other revenue sources? What I want to paint the picture here is we weren't part of the calculations. We keep our rates less than 40% of our income. We try and keep them as low as possible. We're doing all these things with saving money. We're trying new revenue sources. Set the scene. I mean, I know we're not the problem child, but we just really need to set the scene. In other words, because they will always find an example of something that we have done which they believe potentially is a waste of money, all right? And unfortunately, those things will happen. But so I'm just trying to give you I think the evidence-based will help you in the next stage, because I understand this is very, we never do consultation over Christmas. This has been a very tough process for us in so much that we've got it very late in the year, we have to have it back. So I think the next stage is almost more important than this stage, but let's get as much in there as we can to build our case. And I just think we need to sell our story as better as possible. Sorry, that was moving into...
Just on that last piece, yes, we can beef out what we have done in terms of alternative revenue sources. One of the things that we've mentioned in here is actually this policy could have the opposite impact and could actually drive councils away from those in some ways less reliable revenue sources, because we have rates there as a backstop, you can build up these other revenue sources. But actually, what it may mean is that because councils are so constrained that they seek more predictability, and what that could mean in terms of interest rate settings and also in terms of non-rates revenue, where those can be variable if you don't have the backstop of rates.
And finally, on the credit rating stuff, we have maintained our AA credit rating, all right? Now, that has been really tough at times. There are people around this table that sat through COVID and still kept our high credit rating. Now, I don't know what other councils do by way of their credit rating, but I know we've talked about it. I really think you need to play that up, because we could get a downgrade, my question, a downgrade of 1 or 2 points in our credit rating will almost take so much money from stuff that we can't deliver. We're even going further down the path. So I think, again, giving weight to our submission on the importance of our credit rating, and we've never lost it, ever. For all that some people out there in the big wide world think we're not doing very well, we've always kept it, and it's so important to keep, because lowering it costs us money, and the worry about what happens if that actually occurs.
Yes, so we're very mindful of impacts on the credit rating. I guess it's pleasing that DIA are aware of that issue, and we've got good constructive discussions with them, and they've talked to rating agencies before their announcement, so they're aware of it. I think the challenge is making sure that that the way it's implemented doesn't create unintended consequences. So the devil's in the detail. The rating agencies have looked at it, and they're sort of keeping a wait and see approach at the moment. But we need to make sure that the way this is implemented, doesn't create unintended consequences. It has a much greater impact on the credit rating than perhaps people first thought. So there's a lot of stuff that we've provided in here, and we'll keep talking to DIA to make sure that the way it's implemented has the least worst impact on the credit rating.
Councillor Patterson-Hamlin, please.
Thank you. Thoroughly enjoyed reading the submission. That was cool. Did the cabinet papers in any way, I couldn't tell from the material I had, but acknowledge the current significant differences in terms of the starting point for each local authority. So I was in Dunedin when this news came through, and so quick back of the envelope calculation, property rated at $850,000 in Dunedin is paying 55% more in rates than in Auckland, so we'd have to increase our rates by 55% to be matching the equivalent in Auckland. So when we're talking about percentages, that's obviously quite significant. Is there anything in the cabinet papers or the draft formula or anything like that that acknowledges that, or is it just total blank slate, as Councillor Turner said, crude lever? Cool description, yeah.
I don't remember seeing anything like that in the cabinet papers. I would know, other councils have raised that points in their draft submissions that I've seen. It's actually quite an excellent point, and one I wish I'd put in our draft submission.
Yeah, I think the short answer is probably no. There isn't a lot in there. Most of the language is generic and talks about all councils as if they're all the same. One of the 5 questions I've asked is, do there need to be variations between different types of councils? So they're kind of asking us that question.
Councillor Henderson, please.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. I'll reserve my right to speak. So what consultation did the government have with us before announcing this rate capping proposal? Polls. Okay. Thanks, Mayor. I'll take that one. So just into the nuts and bolts, there was an interesting point about local board targeted rates. I just want to pick that up to kind of tease it out. So if they consulted and they implemented a targeted rate, that would count towards the overall cap of council, meaning this body would have to find more savings or raise fees and charges higher or something like that because of a body doing something that we have no say over. Would that be true?
Well, you would have say over the local board. You could tell the local board no, and you might decide you want to reserve all the caps for regional infrastructure investment, and so the incentive may be for a governing body to not let local boards or bids go above a certain level. So yeah, that is the way it works. If one part of Auckland wants to have higher rates, you've got to have less somewhere else, which we struggle to understand the rationale for.
Yeah, really troubling democratic implications there when we're a co-equal branch of local government, eh? Just a last one, it's kind of a nuts and boltsy, the New South Wales government essentially has to prepare 2 budgets, which, it's prudent for them to do that in their circumstances, but it sounds like a lot of work. So what would be the practical consequences on staffing and costs to prepare 2 budgets instead of 1?
So it would require a lot of time and cost for us, time and cost, time for the members. It also creates lots of uncertainty. So if you think about transport investment and think going and building things, you wouldn't know whether you can proceed with capital projects until potentially the last minute. And that has always been a challenge that we've had. You can't just turn on infrastructure investment, turn it on and off at the drop of a tap. Same with events programs and things like that. There is always a lead-in and pathway. So having that uncertainty around, is it going to be budget A with lots of investment or budget B with not a lot? How do you actually implement that quickly? So you're kind of always in a transition phase. It would create lots of disruption. So there's cost, disruption, uncertainty. And in terms of the community, how are developers, how's the community going to know which budget you're going to go with? There's lots of unintended consequences all around.
Thanks, I appreciate that answer, and it's raised another interesting point there. So would it be fair to say that this runs contrary to things like a 30-year transport plan, for example, because the infrastructure pipeline is less certain? Would that be fair to say?
I think it's quite unhelpful. In terms of in terms of supporting long-term infrastructure investment, one of the, because you've had uncertainty about what you can afford in the budget, that is unhelpful. It's also, I think, unhelpful in terms of thinking about co-investment with government or the private sector on big long-term projects, because a lot of the time, council has to take a lot of residual cost risk. What if costs move higher or lower, and your rates are capped? So the incentive will be to not take any risk. Only enter into long-term agreements and long-term plans when you know you've got headroom, you know what the costs are. So it's quite a negative for infrastructure investment, and that's why I think Treasury's called out this policy might have serious impacts in terms of increasing the infrastructure deficit over time rather than improving it.
And that cost risk appetite will also flow through to operating costs. So in things such as interest rate hedging, in terms of council long-run contracts. Councils be incentivised to lock in prices over a long term, even if that has a cost. And because the certainty will be required, we wouldn't be able to take any cost risk. And so we would have to pay over the odds to know how much things are going to cost over time.
Thank you. Really appreciate your work on this. Thanks, Mayor, and I'll speak later.
Okay, Councillor Burns.
Thank you very much. Two questions, please. Firstly, doesn't come as a surprise. Government has been going on for years about niceties versus necessities. The RNZ poll, what Deputy Mayor brought up, the facts are quite interesting. So for the public, $2.79, what the Mayor's saying versus what the Taxpayers Union is saying of $36.85 is quite a big difference. So what's correct, $2.79 a month or $36.85 a month?
Well, for Auckland, it's zero. That applies to other councils. The $2.79 is what's in the cabinet. Is derived from the cabinet papers.
Because they've sent out some stats and results today which say something different. So the second thing was following on from Desley Simpson's long-term plan and adding those projects in. So I guess two parts to that question is, A, in the discussions, obviously yesterday or in other times, has it been identified and can we do it, Deputy Mayor is saying, and add those projects in? Because as far as I'm led to believe, that it is saying that we can apply for in exceptional cases for projects, and that's not limited. So with it being long-term plan, we know the big projects that are forecasted. So would that be identified? Because isn't the answer that the process is allowing the increases for the major projects? That's what I've been led to believe.
So there is a process for exemptions. So if there's desire to do a large project and there's government agreement, there is some kind of a process for that. But I guess what we're saying is the time frame for that, the uncertainty around that is unhelpful. If it's going to take a really long time and it's going to take 18 to 20 months to get approval for it, that's really problematic. So we think the process of how you get approval, who makes its decisions, what are the parameters around that is quite important. And I think for all the reasons we've outlined in terms of impact on potential impacts on credit rating, that cost risk aversion. If the aim is to invest in infrastructure and make a difference, this policy is not helpful. And that the element, as has been discussed, there is already a strong focus on balancing affordability versus investment already, and it's not Auckland where you've seen those really large rates increases.
Just on that then, will we be adding in then about that we want processes sped up? Because if we land in a position that that's going to happen anyway, wouldn't we want to identify that we want the process, because there's other processes that are sped up and fast-tracked. So if we are identifying the long-term projects, why wouldn't we put in there that we want the process fast-tracked?
Yes.
Because we don't want to be held back from process, because that's the whole thing that they talk about is red tape. So why would they red tape infrastructure and transport projects that have been in the plan for so long?
It's a great question. We can't understand. I'm not quite sure why they've kind of gone down this sort of quite a bureaucratic process. It does seem to be contrary to other policies. So our feedback basically says we don't support the idea of a rates cap, but if one is going to be introduced, then we would like to see it done in a way that makes these things as fast and as flexible as possible, so we can achieve those outcomes. So that element is in there. Yeah.
Okay, I've got no more questions, so we'll have a little debate if anyone, but some of that sounded like a debate to me anyhow. But in the meantime, I've learnt from those questions that probably everyone will be declaring storms much quicker so that you can get underway to get the exemption. And the idea of an exemption taking 18 months for a 12-month LTP, I was Councillor Williamson's rather cleverly put that it's rather like a 10-month waiting list for maternity. I did raise with the powers that be yesterday that I felt that if you're really going to do this, why not electricity costs? And then very senior politicians, in fact the most senior one, suggested that rates were the biggest driver of the increase in cost of living. And I'm thinking that is complete rubbish. Electricity is actually closing down businesses and costing jobs. And it is already monitored by a government department. And the line, and I have some experience having, more than any of the politicians, having run 2 major lines companies. That's where a cap should go, or a cap on Air New Zealand flight costs would be good, because they've got out of control as well. You can now fly from Kerikeri on Barrier Area at only half the price of Air New Zealand. There you go. So we'll have a bit of debate about here. But we seem to be spending an awful lot of time debating something which is really a load of old rubbish, but I'll go through the process and I'll be opened by Councillor Ferry. Thank you.
Kia ora. Yes, I wanted to address that cost of living issue as well. Because I'm a nerd, I did do some work on how much transport had cost our family from November 2024 to October 2025. It was over double what we have paid in rates. And so the suggestion, and we're a household that uses public transport a lot, doesn't run expensive cars. Indeed, one of the cars that we use is a company car. So we have lower transport costs than most, but what has increased that significantly over the last couple of years is my children no longer getting the subsidies that they were previously getting through central government for their public transport trips to and from school in particular. That put transport costs up a lot for us. So if government is serious about reducing cost of living, they have some mechanisms available to them, things they've indeed used in the past to reduce transport costs, which for our household would have a more significant impact than a rates cap. I noted also that we pay more in insurance than we pay in rates for our household as well. The other thing I'd note is that Auckland Council already has one of the most accessible rates postponement schemes too, in terms of addressing hardship. I'm not saying that rates is not a hardship for some people, it absolutely is. We have a rates postponement scheme that basically you don't have to prove hardship. That's quite unusual nationally, so that's something that they might want to look at, encouraging other councils to look at. And the other thing that would be particularly valuable for those on low incomes that council could intervene with would be the Department of Internal Affairs rates rebate scheme, which is set at quite a low floor and a high ceiling for incomes. So they have some tools at their disposal that could help with the rates burden. I already asked in questions about helping us with some non-rates revenue, which again would help with the rates burden for those paying rates. So yeah, I strongly support this submission. We've made a number of suggestions, I think, that would improve it further, and looking forward to seeing how those are reflected in the final submission. Thank you.
Councillor Henderson, please.
Came to me a bit quicker than I was expecting. Yeah, just acknowledging staff who've done an excellent job at summarising the many and varied ways that this is a problematic proposal. I do hope central government listens to these very well-reasoned arguments. Staff were right to essentially point out its failure as a policy in Australia, but I also want to point out its failure as a policy in the UK, where it's literally bankrupting several councils. I don't know how that benefits their residents and ratepayers. Rates capping, to me, is a total affront to democracy. The bizarre prospect that we would have to go cap in hand to an MP from Nelson or Gisborne or Wellington to get them to dictate our budget back to us in that way. That's insulting, I think, to all Aucklanders who vote us in to do that. And I think it actually essentially installs commissioners through the back door for councils across the country. The public, of course, get their say in our system through feedback to the annual plans. We consult on everything down to yellow lines on a road. Crucially, we consult on plans and how to pay for them every 3 years at the ballot box. That is how the system works. You go to the public and you say, this is what I want to do. The public rightfully say, well, how are you going to pay for it? And you've got to answer that. And then they put you here to do that. It is anti-democratic to introduce artificial controls on this, preventing us from actually enacting the will of the voters that put us here. Parliament would never accept such controls themselves. I'm not aware of any cap that they have on their revenue collection. There's no cap on income tax, things like that. And I also note that we actually maintain our assets much better than many government departments ourselves. So maybe getting their own house in order would be the first port of call. I have serious concerns about how this would impact our ability to fund much needed infrastructure. You don't need to go far, either in this country or looking at our own history as a city, to show that if you cut spending on maintenance or you defer it, which is exactly what would happen, you're just handing the problem down to the next generation, where it's 5 times bigger, 5 times more expensive. And it would be a serious shirk on our ability to manage the city's finances prudently. The problems aren't just long-term, they're in the day-to-day as well. And how it would work in practice is local government would have to cut services, would have to put increases on their non-rates revenue to cover it, probably both. So to support rates capping, I argue, would be to support hiking entry to things like swimming pools, hall hire, dog registration, all manner of these services, and to cut their services as well. It would be that would be a real impact on household budgets of struggling families. That's a cost of living crisis. Lastly, I note this is central government election year, also known as silly season, and governments across time and space love to have a crack at councils and see if they can get a few votes out of it. To me, that seems the primary motivator. Councillor Ferry noted the excellent ways the government could tomorrow help the cost of living for Auckland residents. And particularly, I would point out the rates rebate scheme that was mentioned could be adjusted to help low-income families in Auckland tomorrow. That can be done. But it's cynical politics, especially when you consider the amount of good that local government does in the everyday lives of struggling Aucklanders, from parks to libraries to clean running water, many, many, many else besides. Rate capping puts all these things at risk. It kneecaps future generations of Auckland communities. We should not support this. We should wholeheartedly oppose it, and I'm glad that this submission does that. Thank you, Mayor.
Here. Councillor Fully.
Kia ora, thanks, Chair, and I'm just going to tautoko everything that Councillor Henderson and Councillor Ferry have said before me as well. And I have to say, I find it incredible that, you know, almost every department, almost all of their own departments have told them that they don't support a rates cap, and yet the government has chosen to completely ignore that feedback and pursue and go forward with this rates cap. And I have to agree with Councillor Henderson from the other side of Auckland when he says that, you know, this is about getting votes in an election year. That's probably the primary driver here. You know, that's the elephant in the room here. It's really popular at the moment to blame councils, to point the finger at local government and blame us. And so the government is jumping on that bandwagon in order to get a few votes, well, probably lots of votes, by sending a false message out to residents, to Aucklanders and to New Zealanders, that this is going to save them money and this is going to somehow cure the cost of living crisis. It's not, because if we're not able to get that funding through rates, as Councillor Henderson has said, we're going to have to get it some other way, by charging at our swimming pools, by charging at our libraries maybe, by closing down some of those really essential services to our communities that we rely on. We've just talked about, you know, how communities really came to the fore and really helped during emergencies. We've seen that across the country recently. You know, this is not going to help the cost of living crisis in the way that the public are being led to somehow believe. And I want to also support that this is another example of central government overstepping and making decisions that rightfully belong to us in local government, that we have been elected to make. And although I think we as Auckland will do quite well, even if this does come through, given that the cap is at around 4%, I really feel for other councils. What the heck is Wellington going to do? Their pipes are bursting under their feet. A cap like this, it would be disastrous for a place like Wellington and many other councils around the country. So I strongly support the submission. I thank our staff for the hard work that they've put in over Christmas and New Year to get this through, and I look forward to perhaps a more comprehensive submission as well if we get an opportunity to do that and make another submission later on down the track. Kia ora. Thanks, Your Worship.
Thank you very much. Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you, Mayor. As Councillor Burns said, I don't understand why they would want to add this sort of red tape. It is completely undemocratic. We don't know who has the final decision. And we hear all the time from this government about unelected people on councils. Well, it will mean that we have to go back to mum and dad at the big beehive and go, please, sir, can we please have some more? Because that is what is going to happen to us and to every council, no matter if it's they'll say it's automatic with a storm or a extreme weather event, but what is the level? Are they going to say you can pay for repairs, but you can't pay for adaptation? I've sat on panels with the local government minister, who's also the climate minister, talking about our need as a council to do managed retreat and to adaptation because they're not going to do buyouts anymore. If we can't, in our next plan or our next LTP or the one after that, plan and help our communities prepare for climate change, which we're seeing right across the country, that is not in our budgets right now. We have communities who are desperate for funding to protect them or to deal with the flooding that we've seen over the last few years. We will probably keep below the 4%, and that is what we're planning to do and trying our best in saving funding. But the times we've popped out of it are inflation, which is nothing to do with us, and that has been worldwide, nationwide. We had to do that. And guess what? We consulted with the public. And I remember sitting here with you, Mayor, saying, please, can we at least ask the public if they don't want to see these dramatic cuts to services? I think it was bus services, library hours, the Citizens Advice Bureau, environment funding, bunch of things, local board funding. We said, can we ask the public if they'd be okay with increased rates if we didn't cut these things? And what happened? We had the record turnout of submissions, over 40,000, most ever, and 70% of Aucklanders who submitted said we would prefer to pay slightly more rates to protect all these services. So we've asked our community, we've said, what do you want, cuts or rates? And in that case, they chose rates. The local government minister has said to myself and yourself, Mayor, and to Councillor Deputy Mayor as well, oh, well, if you've got a big transport project, yeah, you'll probably get that. And look, like, say a pool or something, if a community wanted that, yeah, you apply, you'll probably get that. Maybe in a storm, you'll probably get that. Adaptation depends on the... So really, this is just a fake policy that is not real. So we can go to whatever government of the day it is and go, please, look, and then all we have to do is get that community to lobby that MP, and that MP talks that we're seeing it right now with a whole bunch of things. And they will get the project over the line. But it's not a way to do a budget. That will take months and months, huge amount of money. Look at the water care compliance now. That's costing us over $1 million a year for a regulator. We'll be paying for the regulator that has to regulate the work we're doing. If we keep to the 4%, that'll be fine. But inflation is going up. Last month, inflation went up again. What if, like we saw in 2023, we blow out, our budget, our long-term plan blows out because inflation goes up, because our requirements under the PSA, the December issue of the inflation figure automatically increases wages higher than we projected in the LTP, our borrowing figures, the slight change in a credit rating, it could keep very good, but a slight change can mean borrowing our sovereign risk goes up even slightly. If 0.5% of an interest rate on the borrowing we have right now is $70 million. That might mean we can keep to the 4%, but we'll have to move $70 million from services to interest. And I'm pretty sure that change, which people don't understand because it's not sexy to put in a poll or a headline, that change will still keep the public purse the same, but we'll have to do some dramatic cuts to what people want. And I know that every time cuts happen, whether it's libraries, bins, mowing of the parks, people complain. And that's going to happen again. I just think this is the most bizarre thing, apart from the politics, we understand it, to require of councils. And it's a shame that we did ask if Auckland could be removed from that. But they said no. We're just like any other council, because other councils have put up their rates 12, 15, 20%, while we were keeping ours around 5 or 6. We're all being treated the same. A big tut-tut-tut to councils who are democratically elected. So whether you agree with high rates or low rates, the fact is we're being told that we need to put our budget through processes the government doesn't have to do. They can pass a budget very quickly with no consultation. We have to have asset management plans. We have to do depreciation. We have to do auditing. We have to consult. They don't have to do any of those things. We're already doing all of those things, and now they're going to have a rates cap on, like New South Wales, but not put any of the transfers, that government funding, into what we're doing here, which will hamstring us into the future and leave future generations poorer for the decisions that the government will make this year. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Councillor Turner, please.
Thank you. The reason the rates are being focused on is because they're the most visible. We're talking about fixing Auckland. For the whole time I've sat here, we've talked about pay more, pay less, get less. We just never seem to be able to get to pay the same and get more. The public are angry about rates and are sympathetic to this because of what they observe. You know, just in the last 2 weeks, this is an Auckland transport issue, and I understand that we're in the middle of trying to restructure how that operates. But just in the last 2 weeks, I've been called to streets where footpaths have been rebuilt. Any layperson can see that. Why the hell didn't they do just further up the street where it's actually falling apart? Another street where there was cones put out 2 times in a row. There was signages put out 2 times in a row over a 3-week period. The locals all made sure they vacated the road. They came and nailed the little clippy bits in on all the road signs so that once they've resealed, you know where to paint the triangles, etc. And then they vacated and took everything away twice. The last time they sent everyone a message, oh, it's been cancelled. This is why people are looking at our spending and saying it's nonsense. And how can we possibly get them back on track? So, you know, I was approached by several entities during the election to pledge a rate cap, to give a rate cap pledge. I refused because of a bunch of the other comments people have made around here, which are valid. But there's that important, you know, lesson that we're all told when we're talking about complaint processes and all that sort of stuff. There's nothing wrong with positive criticism, and we need to use it to look at what the message the public are trying to send us, and not build a story to tell them why they're wrong. I will vote for this submission, but I am sympathetic to what is trying to be told to us here. Thank you.
Councillor Williamson, next, please.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. And can I just say that this is an issue that is not binary. It is not a yes, I'm in favour of it, or I'm not against it. This has got so many nuances to it. And one of them I want to just repeat for you. The Mayor quoted them before, but I just want you to know this because it is quite hypocritical of a central government. Their tax take has gone over the last 5 years, I've compared 5 years running, from 77 billion to 115.4 billion, and that is a 48.5% increase. So their incomes have gone up 48.5% over the same time. For Auckland Council, our rates have gone from 1.976 billion to the 2.786 for the full year that I'm taking into account, a 41%. Theirs was 48.5, ours has gone up 41. So it's a bit rich for someone who is spending and taking an income's way higher increase rate than ours to be telling us we shouldn't be putting ours up. I find that just insulting. The second point in this nuance is to do with there are huge plots of land all around the city that the government own and don't pay rates on. Universities, schools, defence land, there's a mess of it. And I just think that if they were being genuine about what the costs were and that, they would actually say, well, we need roads and footpaths and water and wastewater to all our facilities, and so we will be paying accordingly to cover that. You take away a big pressure point off us on that. But I reckon the biggest one of the nuances is to do with the cost impost that central government put on us. They pass legislation all the time. I used to do it. And we pass legislation knowing there will be a major cost to ratepayers as part of that legislation. They know it. In fact, in many of the advisory notes from your officials, they say this will probably mean an increase in rates of. Again, I find it a bit rich that they pass some of the most ludicrous stuff, and please don't get me to list some of the ludicrous stuff because I could go on for another half hour, that imposes costs on us. That means we have to pose onto the ratepayer. And in this submission, I would wish we would put something in there that said, we demand of you that every piece of legislation you pass from here on out, you quantify what the costs will come to us. What you are passing on to us that we have to pick up, and that'll not be part of any rates cap. Because they could put another 2 or 3 bills through in the next year that put rates way over the cap, and we've got no say in it. So that, well, they already have, and they've done it over and over again. But can I then take the other side of the nuances and be really careful of this? I mean, I'm now past worrying about being re-elected because I'm not going to be in. The biggest cost I'm worried about is crematorium costs. So that, all I can say to you is you need to be wary for you young people about being re-elected, because this does resonate with voters. You don't think the government just sort of reached into its pocket and said, oh, what are we going to do now? They know from their polling what your voters think. And I am really concerned the flavour of this submission looks like we don't want to have any limits on us. We don't care about it. We're not going to have you tell us about how to limit it. And I think this could have been well more written about those stuff that government should be paying for, and things, other revenue streams like giving us a bed tax, and things like the GST they rip off us. But in fact, if you put this submission, the newspapers and the news media will just go out, Auckland opposing, and you local councillors will have voted for opposing for, and it will hurt you if you are one of those that are interested in coming back here. So I'm disappointed in the way the narrative's been written and the way the submission's been made, but I think we should make a lot more evidence about the government is the biggest driver of costs. The government is the lowest payer towards what it should be, in other words, zero around the place. And if we got all of those tidy, then I think we probably could start to live within our means and live within a cap, but not while it is currently the way it is. So I repeat again, their revenue, I'll give you their annual revenue, 58.9 billion from individual tax, 29.2 billion from GST, 18.7 from company tax, and 8.6 billion from other. We don't even have that sum of money, and this is just from other. And so they've gone up 48.5% over that 5 years, and we've only gone up 41. I'll leave it at that.
Well, that was a good one. Thank you for that. Emerged from the dark with a wonderful speech.